Hi, I'm Lauren,
And hi, I'm Genna.
and we are going to be talking about hauntings and what it means to be haunted. So, I define like a haunting as something like unforgettable and something that like kind of evokes feelings of like regret or fear or like a feeling of powerlessness because I think in essence a haunting is something that is beyond our power or something that we can escape, and that's what makes it so terrifying. And yeah.
I definitely agree with that. And I think there's kind of two components to it. So, like, in a traditional sense, to be haunted kind of means to be overcome by something supernatural. So, for example, like a ghost or being in a haunted house. But I also think that it can mean something that's not supernatural, that continually manifests itself. So,
Yeah.
like, a psychological haunting, so trauma, fear, or I guess really anything that kind of consumes someone's psyche. Yeah, so something that psychologically sticks with you that can be manifested either externally or internally. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we totally see that in Haunting of Hill House, where we see kind of a mix of like the classic like supernatural haunting and then like a psychological haunting going on, especially with Eleanor's story. And I just want to look at like in the first chapter where Shirley Jackson opens with that one line: "No living organism can continue till for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream." And I think it kind of sets the tone for our protagonist, Eleanor, who has become like consumed and haunted by her mundane and restrictive lifestyle. And that's why she's kind of forced to use like her vivid imagination to escape like this boring reality. That's how she kind of escapes like her haunting. And I think also like kind of the more traditional hauntings we see in Haunting of Hill House, like the house itself, it's like kind of personified. Like it seems like it's alive. Like there's this eerie feeling when like Eleanor drives up to the house and she like feels like she has to turn back because of this ominous feeling she's getting from the house.
Agreed. And I think the author definitely uses a lot of imagery, especially at the
Mm-hmm.
beginning, to portray this kind of darkness in the traditional haunting. Like when she explains the trees and how they're like long and tall and dark in the forest leading up to Hill House, it kind of foreshadows for not just the physical haunting, but the psychological haunting that comes along with it.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think like Shirley Jackson, she also uses a lot of like synesthesia, like how like you could really experience what Eleanor's experiencing because of like the diction that Jackson uses, like when she's kind of getting lost in like her fantasies about like this mansion that she comes across when she's on her way to Hill House, like how she could imagine herself dining alone in like a quiet dining room and like the sunlight like coming in through the windows.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think part of what has to do with Eleanor's eventual psychological haunting, and we see it at the beginning as well, is her kind of loneliness throughout the book. So at the beginning, hold on, let me look for, I think I had a quote here somewhere. Oh, yeah, okay. At the beginning of the book, the narrator explains that Eleanor has always been lonely, and she says she can never remember being truly happy in her adult life. She had spent so long alone with no one to love.
Mm-hmm.
And I think beyond like the first physical haunting, that loneliness becomes her psychological haunting.
Yeah.
So, as Eleanor is in Hill House and she starts to kind of make friends, I think that brings up her subconscious trauma in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And on the surface, like these physical hauntings end up becoming her psychological haunting. And at the end, she becomes the haunting herself. And she actually carries out the hauntings. And she mimics what was done to her before, when she was on the other end of the hauntings.
Mm-hmm.
And this time, instead of being afraid of it like she is in the beginning, she feels, quote, protected and warm by Hill House. And she actually thinks to herself, I am home. So I think home in that situation most likely means feeling protected and secure in her loneliness, kind of as she has always felt throughout her life. Yeah.
Okay. So now that we've kind of touched on like a traditional haunting and like a psychological haunting, I think we should move on to like what we've covered with Emily Dickinson and like A Quiet Passion. Just like as a bit of background, Emily Dickinson was a female poet that lived in the 1800s, and she is kind of known for being a feminist writer and for her very progressive work and progressive thinking in terms of like what it means to be a woman and like gender roles and like domestic life. So I think what we see in like the film A Quiet Passion that follows Dickinson from her childhood up until her death is Dickinson is really haunted by more abstract forms of hauntings, I guess, like with gender roles and gender expectations. Like she's constantly harassed about like her love life and marriage, as well as what it means to be a woman, like how she's kind of encouraged to have a domestic life and how she's considered to be too ambitious for wanting to pursue a career in poetry. We also see like how she's pressured to be religious and also kind of maybe like a little bit of ambiguity about her sexuality there as well, and all these factors coming to haunt her up until the end of her life.
Yeah, agreed. And when she was writing her poetry, as you said, she was surrounded by these standards that came to haunt her, such as like the submissive gender roles placed upon women and their general lack of freedom. And I think because of this, Dickinson became very isolated when she didn't marry, and she lost one of her closest friends to marriage. I think that through her poetry, we could definitely see these different themes. So, for example, in her poem Ghost, she compared a mental or psychological haunting to an actual physical haunting. So one of the lines read, "One need not be a chamber to be haunted, one need not be a house. The brain has corridors surpassing material place." And she essentially uses the physical imagery of a haunted or creepy house to emphasize her subconscious traumas and fears that one might have, and how our internal psyche haunts us as well, and how our brain has these long, scary corridors equal to that of a haunted house. And she also said that one's own self-encounter is a lonesome place, which means having to dig into our trauma and our fears is, again, lonely, because only the individual can truly experience and genuinely feel that particular feeling and experience. And one can sympathize and empathize with it, but one cannot truly ever feel that exact experience. So I think she was definitely affected by these gender roles and stuff, and that's reflected in her poetry as she becomes more and more isolated.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that you bring up too. Like, kind of the feeling of being lonely and isolated is definitely like a common theme in all of these works. Like, I think even like with how much she did put into her work, it kind of isolated herself even more so than like how much she was isolated because she was kind of challenging traditional gender roles and expectations.
Yeah, I think that both definitely had to do with her isolation.
Yeah, and I think also with like A Quiet Passion, we really see how like Emily Dickinson's like identity has almost come to haunt her because of all the consequences that it invites. And I think it's a really interesting segue into our next topic, like kind of showing how we could be haunted by our own identities, and because it's something that we can't escape. Like I think we see this in Dennis Smith's Summer Somewhere and also in Lovecraft Country. So do you want to get into Dennis Smith?
Yeah, for sure. So in Smith's poem Summer Somewhere, he definitely used poetry mechanics. For example, imagery to illustrate an afterlife for Black men, especially those who were murdered by police brutality. And his poem addresses hauntings through a historical lens and specifically racial hauntings. So in this afterlife that his poem creates, the men are reborn as, quote, boys, and I think he uses the word boy to suggest innocence and the naivety that children have.
Yeah.
And in that afterlife, he says that they can't recall their white shirts turned ruby gowns, which means they can't recall their violent deaths. And in the poem, Smith speaks of Sean Bell, who was shot and killed by the NYPD the day before his wedding.
Yeah.
And Smith says that in his afterlife, Sean Bell has renamed himself I Do, I Do. And similarly with Emmett Till, who's lynched because he was a little white woman, he, in the poem, in afterlife, declared himself as, quote, the god of whistling. So both of those are, in a sense, metaphorically resurrecting these men and addressing the trauma and fear and legacy, like a haunting that brutality against the African American community has left behind, as police brutality and lynching definitely haunts the Black community and history and their identity.
Yeah, totally. I think also in the poem, Genna Smith suggests summertime can invite like its own hauntings, because kind of what we covered in class and what the professor pointed out, like in the summertime, we see like all these people going outside because the weather's nice, and the crime rate actually increases because all these people are outside. And I think it's also like an interesting connection, like sun, summertime, and also what we kind of covered in Lovecraft Country with like a sundown town. Like the sun almost seems to be like a threat to the Black community, because in Lovecraft Country we see like a sundown town is like these neighborhoods that basically enable racially motivated violence. And we see in Lovecraft Country how the main cast ends up finding themselves in a sundown county, and even though it looks like they're about to escape, they really aren't safe or free from this haunting, because it is a part of their identity. But yeah, moving on to Lovecraft Country, I think it kind of echoes what Genna Smith was talking about with like this historical haunting coming to haunt present day like African Americans.
Agreed. And I think one of the things that I guess haunts them is not just this racial discrimination, but also the literal monster. And I think those literal monsters are supposed to be kind of like, I guess, personifications, even though they're not people, of discrimination and racism, and how it literally terrorizes them and tries to kill them.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think because also both the sheriffs and the monsters come out at sundown to basically hunt our main cast, and even one of the sheriffs that gets bitten by one of these monsters transforms into a monster. It kind of really is like highlighting how like these sheriffs are kind of deadly to the African American community. And I think also kind of what we discussed in our engagement post this week, the reason or the kind of juxtaposition of the main cast and the sheriffs and how they handled the situation. I thought that was an interesting question that the professor brought up, because I feel like the main cast is used to kind of being in a very adrenaline state, because I mean, as we've seen in the show, they are constantly being like harassed or hunted down. So I feel like maybe fighting monsters isn't the scariest thing to them. So they were able to remain kind of level-headed.
Yeah, agreed.
What we could talk about next is kind of how do we escape these hauntings? Like, is there an escape or is there no escape? What do you think?
I think it really depends on what personal path the person decides to take, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, for example, in Haunting of Hill House, Eleanor tried to escape her haunting by literally killing herself.
Yeah.
And this can definitely go either way, but personally, the way I see it is that by killing herself, she actually made herself stuck at Hill House. And even though she appeared to enjoy being there at the end, I think the only reason she enjoyed being there was because she was in her comfort zone of being lonely.
Yeah.
And her killing herself actually made her just forever stuck there and in that haunting.
Personally, I had a little bit of a different interpretation of Eleanor taking her life. I thought that this was an example of her finally reclaiming her autonomy and exerting free will, which is arguably how you could escape a metaphorical haunting or a psychological haunting, because all her life, her actions have kind of been dictated by her time with her mother and kind of that haunting, as well as like the abuse that she suffered at the hands of like her sister and her brother-in-law. So I think this is like her final act of defiance. That's how she's escaping like this haunting that she's been dealing with all her life, because now the words of her mother and her sister-in-law, like they can't hurt her anymore, and she's finally free. And I think we see like a lot of like these escapes through death with like Emily Dickinson, who's finally free from like all these expectations after she died.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you could also make the case that there's no escape from these hauntings, and I think we could really see that in like Genna Smith's poem, because even like you mentioned, like in the afterlife, the dead can still be haunted by what's going on like in society, just as much. Like the dead can be haunted just as much as the living can.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I also think that like in the short story, The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, there's some things maybe that we can escape, like our destiny. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think at least in this story, the main character, Louise, at first she thought she had free will, but once her consciousness shifted, because she learned the language of heptapod B, she realized that destiny wasn't exactly set, but she didn't really want to mess with it because she respected her destiny and everyone else's destiny, and she didn't want to change it, even though she knew that like her daughter was gonna die early. She still followed through with what was gonna happen, and she still had her child. And I think that someone, at least in this book, who wasn't aware of their free will in Louise's eyes, they were lucky, and she envied them, because though one might be haunted by their free will, Louise, who experienced both the illusion of free will and the truth of not having free will, realized that the true haunting takes place when one realizes that free will isn't real. And because of that, she seems to somewhat envy those who do have free will. And she's sort of haunted by the fact that she doesn't have that.
Yeah, I think that for sure. Like even in the interview, I think Ted Chiang kind of talked about how there is, like what you said, like an illusion of free will, and we really can't escape our destinies, which is a haunting in itself. And I think also like following up with the idea of like there is no escape from these hauntings, I think like even besides like what we've covered, like you can't really escape like history or your identity either, which is what kind of we covered in Lovecraft Country and Nesmith's poem and like Dickinson, because we can't really detach ourselves from who we are or from history, because it's inescapable really. And I think that really contributes to the feeling of being haunted and feeling powerless. And I think like going on to conclude like with what the meaning of hauntings like are, I think it really just communicates this act of like wrongdoing and like feeling powerless, because there's this thing that's beyond our influence that's really like terrorizing us or dictating our lives.
Yeah, I agree with that. And adding on to what you're saying, I think that the hauntings can serve as a medium for us to connect with our subconscious and our fears and our traumas. And in my opinion, making that connection can be taken two ways. Either one can face it and address it and work with it so that it no longer haunts them and they accept it, or they can continue to let it haunt them. But in my opinion, the meaning of hauntings is essentially our subconscious fears manifesting themselves either internally and consciously for the first time or externally in like physical hauntings. Because in this sense, hauntings are a way for our brain to bring things up that we mentally need to work on for our own benefit and for our own progression or personal development.
So just based on like what we've covered in class so far, who do you think like you agree with most, like with their take on like a quote unquote haunting, or who do you like disagree with?
I feel like I kind of agree with, at least from the story of your life, I agree with Louise, because knowing that you don't have free will would be kind of horrible. Then you have to just go by how everything's going to happen and you would already know what's going to happen. And honestly, that would be kind of boring. And that would definitely be a haunt, because especially if you know that something horrible is going to happen, but you can't change it, that would be really hard to live with.
Yeah. I think the one that I disagree with is the story of your life, because personally I don't believe like in destiny or this predetermined fate, because I also kind of think that implies that there is like a higher power at work behind the scenes, or something beyond our control, which I don't really believe in. And I think with like all these kind of more like supernatural hauntings, I don't really believe in, but I do really appreciate the message that all these texts are trying to get behind, with like the more psychological aspect of it and how we can be haunted by our past, or like our identity, or like history and stuff like that.
Definitely.
Okay, that concludes our podcast, I guess. Any final parting thoughts?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.